Nostalgia. It's a hell of a drug. Looking back on things can make you feel like you've entered a time machine. The brain has this bizarre way of romanticizing the past. The concept of nostalgia is usually attached to the 1980s and 90s. You know what? I'm quite burnt out on those decades. They're great and contain some legendary moments. But I'm ready to make myself feel old. Earlier this year we hit the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And it got me thinking, holy shit, the 2000s were 20 years ago. It's so weird how much things have changed. Somehow everything has become even more complex. When I think back to 2001, I have this sense of anxiety and sadness. Is it possible for me to review the year in a positive light regardless of the tragedy that took place? I'm Randy the Shoegazer, and I've been running this channel for about 7 years now. Now, I've tried my hand at many different video series. Last year I took a stab at what was supposed to be the first in a series of videos that talks about music of whatever year, and the year I covered was 1990. Now my fanbase seemed to have liked the video quite a bit, but I don't feel like I did the year in music justice looking back. I only covered about 30-odd something albums, and the video was only 20-ish minutes long. And I consider myself a pretty big music history geek. And the more research I've done about specific years, the more I've realized, holy shit, things are a lot more complicated in a single year in the world of music. You can't cover that shit in just 20 minutes. So what did I do this time? Well, I'm glad you asked. This time, I listened to 100 albums. Now, I'm sure a few of you that have been lurking at some of my accounts around the internet have seen me talking about this project and was expecting one big long video. And that was my original intention, and I'm probably going to do a mega edit later, but I started thinking about it, and I don't think it's really going to attract that many viewers, because my name's not all that big. So, I'm going to break this up. This video is not going to contain any of the album reviews, but the next one will start doing that. The purpose of this one is to talk about the history, the general history of 2001 in the music world. Genre-specific history will be talked about in each genre video, as well as the albums that fall into that genre. So if you want to know what was going on, say, in the world of jazz in 2001, you're gonna have to wait a little bit. So, without further hesitation, this is Music of the Year 2001. Okay, 2001. What the fuck was happening? Well, the year started off rather quietly. The internet was slowly starting to take over the world. The United States was getting involved in this whole recount business. Oh, and music execs were starting to shit their pants about this whole piracy business. The internet and the introduction of the MP3 are probably two of the most important developments in the history of music since the introduction of recorded sound. People were willing to wait an hour to download a 3-minute song, then take the time to drive down to the local record store and buy an album that was at least half full of songs that they didn't want. And while this trend started in the late 1990s, this wouldn't be something that we would see the full effects of until we're well into the 2000s. 2001 saw a lot of different key events. Apple released its first iteration of the iPod on October 23rd. While MP3 players had been on the market since 1997, the iPod changed the game in two different ways. First off, Apple was a big name in computers and were starting to make a comeback, so the announcement of this device gave MP3 players a lot more viability. Second off, and probably more importantly, it revolutionized the interface and the design of MP3 players. Before the introduction of the iPod, most players had very limited options. The iPod's simple controls and user-friendly interface would eventually lead to the development of the iPhone and the smartphone as we know it today. So not only was this an important music listening device, it was an overall important device in terms of technology. Napster, the website that popularized the MP3, had to shut down their operations on July 11th after multiple lawsuits. While corporate execs greedily rubbed their hands together thinking that they were the victors, Consumers knew where else to go. There were plenty of other peer-to-peer file-sharing websites and software. The spread of the MP3 could not be stopped, and it would take the music industry well into the decade to finally figure out how to properly monetize it. However, it's important to realize that while the MP3 was starting to gain steam and cut into CD sales, most music consumers were still listening to the radio and were still buying physical media. To people who weren't computer literate, which was still a good chunk of the population, MP3s were expensive and confusing. If you look at the best-selling albums of the year, you still see quite a few that broke that coveted 10 million thresh mark, aka the diamond certification. Best-selling artists from this year include newcomers such as Linkin Park, Shakira, and Pink, but also included already popular names from the past 5 years such as NSYNC and Britney Spears. You also have these obnoxious Now compilations, none of which I'll be reviewing for this video because fuck those things. The most surprising bestseller of the year had to be the Beatles' #1 compilation. This helped mark the resurgence in Beatlemania that we still see today. Music was also moving in a much more electronic direction. 2001 was still pretty early in this era, but this was where we would start to see the slow elimination of live instruments. It's not like they would be eliminated entirely, but you would see a lot more music written on a computer using easy-to-develop and easy-to-use software than you would somebody writing a complicated guitar piece. Finally, and I know this is cliche, but we do need to talk about 9/11. While the longer-lasting effects wouldn't be felt into the next couple of years, there were still a few immediate effects that were felt during 2001 itself. Artists found some of their songs blacklisted from radio airplay because the lyrics were deemed too insensitive. Other artists had to change track listings and/or album art. There was also this briefly felt sense of patriotism that would disappear and turn into rage as the decade went on. Except for in country music, but we'll get to that. Now, enough of all of that. Let me talk about how I developed my list of albums to review for this video. First off, I had to listen to 100 albums. Actually, at the end of it, I listened to 101 because I miscounted, but hey, at least I overachieved by a measly 1 album. Second, they had to have been released in 2001. Hybrid Theory, for instance, was incredibly popular in 2001, but it's actually technically a 2000 album because that was the year where it was released. Secondly, the album had to have met one of the following few criteria. 1, it had to have been critically praised by a number of publications. 2, the album had to have gained a cult following over the years. 3, the album had to have been considered important to its genre and/or movement. 4, the album had to have been listed as a bestseller for either 2001 or 2002. I'm throwing 2002 in there because some albums were released late in the year and didn't end up seeing the bulk of their sales until the following year. 5, the album had to have been significantly critically panned by multiple publications. That's just to justify one particular album on the list that I had to throw in there out of morbid curiosity. There's also a few albums that are listed on here for nostalgic purposes, like albums that I owned in my childhood. I also have a few personal gems listed on here. You'll notice that I also gave letter grades to all of the albums that I've reviewed. My highest letter grade is an S, while the lowest letter grade is an F-. Yes, I know some of you smartasses are going to be all like, it's just an F, you don't give an F+ or an F-. Well, I happen to think that things can fail on multiple different degrees. I give a lot of pluses and minuses because you're going to see a lot of A's and B's listed here, and I kind of want to show like how far into the tier some of these albums got. One more thing I want to add in is that this list is going to be very Americentric. Although there are going to be some international releases that I threw in there, I just didn't want to talk about certain genres or movements that I'm a little bit out of my league trying to cover. 2001 was part of a transitional time for music. The internet was slowly starting to leave its footprint. This transition wouldn't fully end until roughly 2007 or 2008, and record companies were dragged kicking and screaming into this. That's just the way the cookie crumbles sometimes. Join me for the next video when I cover the post-grunge, aka butt rock, aka Nickelback, Creed, Puddle of Mud section of the video, because you guys just want to see me suffer before I do anything else. See ya later.